If I knew it was going to be the Last Supper, I would have wore something different. I'm telling you that right now. But I didn't know. Nobody knew. Who knew? But there we were, all in the upper room. And by the way, upper room is just like a bougie word for upstairs. But here we all were, eating a Passover meal. And if you would have asked any of the 12 if we thought this was going to be our last meal with him, we wouldn't have believed you. I feel like he's been trying to teach us so many things, and I feel like it's just been going all over our heads, right? We have the meal. He washes our feet. And then Jesus, he comes back to the table, right? And he said, what did he say, Peter? He said, I have been eagerly awaiting this Passover meal before my suffering. Suffering? What's suffering? I mean, this has been the greatest week of our lives, right? And then he takes a piece of this bread and he tears some off. He says, eat this, for this is my body. Do this in remembrance of me. Remember. I mean, he's right in front of me, literally. I mean, what's it to remember? And then he takes the cup and he says, drink this. Drink this because I will not drink again of this cup until the kingdom of heaven is here. Friends, drink, for this is my blood, for this is my new covenant that is poured out for everyone. So, we did. And then Jesus, he says to us that one of us is going to betray him. And we're all looking around the table like, I mean, what do you mean? Who is it? Who is it? Who is it? Because here's what you got to keep in mind, right? I mean, the 12 of us, I mean, when we said yes to him, it wasn't like there was one of us that was walking around all nefarious, having the receipts to prove it. We're all going, who is it? Who is it? Because it doesn't make any sense. But I knew this one thing. It wasn't me. It was not me at all. And I looked at him and I said, Jesus, not me. I love you. I love you. I will go to prison for you. And then he said to me, Peter, you will deny me 3 times before the rooster crows. I'm like, no. You are my ride or die wherever you go. And he was like, shh. Peter. Before the sun comes up, you will act like I never even existed. I mean, what am I supposed to do with that, right? I mean, he's my everything. And we just keep asking him, what does it mean in a little while that you're going to go away? Where are you going with the Father? Can someone just please help me make sense of all this? Where is Jesus going?
So where is Jesus going? And what's on Jesus' mind this night? Well, simple answer, the cross. I mean, Jesus here in the upper room, he knows that when this night is over, he's going to be arrested and tried and condemned. And he knows it's going to be not any sort of a long, drawn-out appeal process or stay of execution. Now, Jesus knows that in less than 24 hours, he would die on the cross. But Jesus isn't just thinking about the cross there. Jesus is thinking about us. I mean, in fact, I think that these events in the upper room show us that Jesus actually thinks of us before he thinks of himself. I think that's why Luke makes sure to record this quote of Jesus. I'm reading from Luke chapter 22, verse 15. I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. See, he says that because Jesus is thinking of us before he's thinking of himself. And Jesus knew that the road ahead for his followers was also going to be hard. And Jesus knew that because of what they'd see and experience, that there were things that they'd need so that they could hold on to their faith and later strengthen their faith and accomplish the mission that he would give them. And Jesus knew that we'd need those same things when our road is hard and the way looks dark and difficult and we're wondering about our mission or even how sometimes we'll make it through the day. And so Jesus made sure that this Thursday evening took place in the upper room the way it did because he was thinking about us and what we'd need, even before thinking about what he'd need in the hours ahead. And boy, that's amazing for me to think about. That Jesus thought about me before he thought about himself. And some of the upper room events, as I said, really point that out, I think. So let's dig into that. We're reading from Luke chapter 22, beginning at verse 7.
Then came the day of unleavened bread, on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. Jesus sent Peter and John, saying, "Go and make preparations for us to eat the Passover." "Where do you want us to prepare for it?" they asked. He replied, "As you enter the city, a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him to the house that he enters, and say to the owner of the house, 'The teacher asks, where is the guest room, where I may eat the Passover with my disciples?' He will show you a large room upstairs, all furnished. Make preparations there." They left and found things just as Jesus had told them. So they prepared the Passover. When the hour came, Jesus and his apostles reclined at the table. And he said to them, "I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I tell you, I will not eat it again until it finds fulfillment in the kingdom of God." After taking the cup, he gave thanks and said, "Take this and divide it among you. For I tell you, I will not drink again from the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes."
There's two things that stand out to me as I hear that first section read about Jesus there in the upper room. The first is that just like on Palm Sunday, Jesus gives two disciples a very specific set of instructions. He tells them exactly what they're going to come across and exactly how to respond when those things happen. And then when those things happen exactly as Jesus said they'd happen, it came out exactly the way he said. In fact, Luke is very specific about that. I'm reading from verse 13. They left and found things just as Jesus had told them. And I think Luke's point there in spending almost as much space in this chapter on the preparation for the upper room meal as he does on the events of the upper room, I think his point there is this, that Jesus' word is true, that it's faithful, that it's reliable, that Jesus knows what he's doing and that he means what he says, and that you can count on Jesus' word being reliable 100% of the time, even if at the time you're struggling to see, well, how could that be? And the truth is, sometimes you don't know how, and sometimes you don't know why. But Jesus wants you to know that even if you can't understand the how or the why, you can still trust the what. You can still trust that Jesus said it, and he meant it, and it will come out just like he said. You have his word on it, and his word is faithful and true. Now, the disciples are going to need that later this evening when Jesus said some things that they don't quite understand. Not only have to suffer, but it's something like, well, this is my body, and this is my blood. And I don't know if they could understand how that could be, and yet they could look back later and say, well, Jesus said it, and his word is true and faithful and reliable. And they'd need it in the next 24 hours when they'd see Jesus hanging on a cross, and they had to be questioning pretty much everything about their faith and their life and wondering why. And they'd need it after Easter and as after Jesus' resurrection and ascension, as they embraced Jesus' mission of making disciples of all nations, but all nations didn't embrace them. And and their own road became dark and a little difficult at times again, at those times, they'd need something to be able to, well, to hold on to, something to help them keep the faith, something that would help them even strengthen their faith and help them stay on mission. And they could look back at an event like this, when Jesus gives all these instructions and then they come out exactly like Jesus said, and they could say, okay, I've got the confidence that Jesus' word is true, and it's faithful, that it's reliable, that Jesus means what he says, that his word is true, and I can hold on to that, which is something that I think Jesus' followers in every age need, don't they? Especially when the road is hard or the way is dark, or your faith doesn't seem to be growing, it might even seem to be faltering. Even in times like those, right, Jesus' word is still true. Jesus' word is still faithful. Jesus' word is still reliable. And even though I might not see how it's working out, I can count on the fact that it is working out because Jesus said it, and I believe it. Which again is why I think Jesus gave those detailed instructions for a second time in a few days, because Jesus knew that sometimes people need a little evidence that his word is true, and so he gave it. See, Jesus here is thinking about us before he's thinking about himself. And a second thing I think that shows that here is the time that Jesus is spending with his disciples that night. When time is, well, it's really limited here the night before the cross. And why Jesus wants to make sure it's not just like hanging out time together, any time with them, but it's Passover time that he's spending with them. Now, certainly there's some theological reasons for that Jesus wants them to be able to look back in the light of the cross and see that the Passover meal that they were eating was pointing to the fact that, well, Jesus was God's great rescuer, that he would accomplish God's great rescue mission as the Lamb of God, God's perfect final sacrifice by his death on the cross, taking away the sins of the world. And they'd see all that looking back, and Jesus wanted them to, but he also wanted them to see more. See, Passover was celebrated as a family meal. And so what Jesus is doing here is redefining family, not as blood relations, but as believers. Right? And Jesus wanted his disciples and everyone who believes in him to know, you're my family, and you matter to me, and you'll always matter to me. And I want to spend time with you as my family here. So those two things, you can count on God's word, and you're my family, you matter to me. Those things are important for believers of any generation and every generation to take to heart. And that's why I think Jesus structures this Passover, this upper room meal, the way that he does. Because Jesus knows what we need. And so Jesus is thinking about us even before he's thinking about himself. And speaking about that, there's something that happens next that evening that shows us the same thing. It's in the next section of the meal. Check this out. We're going to start reading at verse 19.
And he took bread, gave thanks, and broke it, and gave it to them, saying, "This is my body, given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, after the supper, he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you."
Now, a Passover meal followed a pretty set formula. You said the same things and did the same things at the same time in that meal, and it didn't vary from year to year to year. You did not change the script, period. The liturgy was the liturgy. Except for this particular meal in this particular year, in this meal in the upper room, Jesus, knowing that he's going to the cross, goes off script. He goes off script and gives some special interpretation at two different points in the evening. First, when the bread is broken and distributed, and then later, right before the third cup, commonly called the cup of redemption, is passed around. This bread, Jesus says, it's not just bread anymore. It is also my body, and it's for you. And this cup, it's not just wine anymore. This cup is now also my blood. These are gifts from me to you. Gifts, ongoing gifts that never run out till the day we celebrate together in heaven. And you may not see how this can be. You may not even be so sure of the why that I'm doing this. But remember that you can trust the what. And because my word is always true. So the gifts that Jesus is giving us here, not just for his disciples, but for us, well, the gifts are his presence. This is my body. I'm here. And his forgiveness. This is my blood, shed for you for the forgiveness of sins. And he gives those gifts, again, because Jesus is thinking of us before he's thinking of himself. And what he's doing is making sure that believers from all time, as they're celebrating this meal that we've come to know as the Lord's Supper, he's giving us something that he knows that we need and that he wants us to have. It's like Jesus is saying, no, I went to the cross to forgive your sin, and I gave up my life so that you can live with me forever. But even though your sin is forgiven at the cross, you are still going to be struggling with sin every single day of your life. And so I'm giving you a gift so that you can know that forgiveness that I purchased for everybody on the cross, that as you receive this meal, you can know that forgiveness is for you. And that even if you don't feel it, you can trust the fact that you're receiving it, that you are forgiven. And you've heard me tell you over and over and over again that I'm with you always, but life is hard, and in a little while you're not going to see me any longer. I'll be there, but you're not going to see me, and you're going to need to know that I am there, so I'm giving you another gift. My real presence. My real presence. This is my body given for you, meaning that I'm here for you. Every time you eat this meal, whether you feel my presence or not, you can trust the fact and the gift that I am here in this meal for you, even if you don't see how. So Jesus says, do this in remembrance of me. And that remembrance is not just remembering Jesus' words, in his service and his sacrifice on the cross. Now, that's happening in the Lord's Supper. But there's a much deeper truth here that Jesus is getting at in pointing out this, do this. He's really saying, into my remembrance. Do this into God remembering his promises and his actions. God remembering his promise to send a rescuer to defeat sin and death and the power of the devil. God remembering what it cost Jesus to do that. And God, who remembers everything, remembering his promise to forget, to remember our sins no more because of what Jesus did for us on the cross. And Jesus knew that sometimes it would be hard to believe that. And it would be hard to keep on believing. And it would be hard to hold on to faith when life becomes challenging, which is why he did what he did that Thursday night before he went to the cross, giving us these special gifts of his forgiveness and his presence. Again, Jesus thinking of us before he was thinking of himself. Now, I don't think the disciples got all that yet. In fact, I don't really think they got it at all, at least not yet. Because listen to what Luke records next in chapter 22. We're starting now at verse 24. Listen.
A dispute also arose among them as to which of them was considered to be the greatest. Jesus said to them, "The kings of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those who exercise authority over them call themselves benefactors. But you are not to be like that. Instead, the greatest among you should be like the youngest, and the one who rules like the one who serves. For who is greater, the one who is at the table or the one who serves? Is it not the one who is at the table? But I am among you as one who serves."
So this is like deja vu. This conversation has been going on among the disciples for some time now about who's the greatest, who's number one, who's first in the pecking order. And Jesus has called them on it before too, but they, like some of us, they're sort of slow learners, and they're products of their environment and of what we call human nature. And once again here, they're puffed up by pride, and they're jockeying for position. And see that selfish and self-centered and self-serving nature that's been the way of the world ever since Adam and Eve made that first big mistake. But that's not the way of Jesus, is it? The way of Jesus is humility and service and sacrifice. And that's why Jesus, even though the time here is short, doesn't just let this go unaddressed. Instead, one more time, Jesus takes the time to teach. He takes the time to teach his disciples that his way is different than the way of the world. Here's the quote from Luke chapter 22, verse 25 and 26. Jesus told his disciples, "The kings of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those who exercise authority over them call themselves benefactors, but you are not to be like that." You are not to be like that. Jesus says you are to follow me. And what you've seen from me these past years is what? Humility, service, sacrifice. You've seen the same thing from me tonight, Jesus is saying. Humility, service, and sacrifice. That's why Luke records Jesus saying this at the end of this section: "I am among you as one who serves." And John, in chapter 13 of his book, as he's recording some of the events of this upper room, records that Jesus goes around and he starts washing the disciples' feet. And then at the end of him washing his feet, here's the quote that John writes from Jesus there, verse 15 of chapter 13. "For I have given you an example that you also should do, just as I have done for you." Humility, service, and sacrifice, an unconditional love. That's the way of Jesus. And that's what they'd see in just a few hours as Jesus was hanging on a cross, suffering and dying, not for anything he'd done, but for the sins of the world. And see, Jesus wants his followers to get that. He wants his followers to get that humility and service and sacrifice is the way of Jesus. See, Jesus knows that humility and service and sacrifice and unconditional love, that's what's going to make a difference in the world. And that's going to lead other people to consider both believing in Jesus and choosing to follow Jesus' way. It's not going to happen if believers are acting just like everybody else around them. But it can happen if his followers offer a better alternative, the way of Jesus, humility and service and sacrifice and unconditional love. And so, even with the cross in front of him there once again, Jesus thinks of us before he thinks of himself. And so even though the time is short, he takes the time again to teach his disciples, this is my way. Because Jesus knows that we need that reminder. Because even after coming to faith, that old, stubborn, sinful nature clings to us pretty strongly. I mean, take a few moments before we go on to think about how that might apply to your life right now. What's one specific thing that you can do this week to practice humility or service or sacrifice? Hit pause and take a few minutes to think about that right now. So we've seen Jesus do several things in an upper room that night that show us that he's thinking about us before he's thinking about himself. We've seen Jesus show us that his word is true, it's faithful, it's reliable, and we can count on it. He's given us some evidence of that. We've seen Jesus show us that we're part of his family and that we matter to him. We've seen Jesus give us some things that we can see and touch and experience so that we can know that no matter what we're feeling, these facts are true, that his forgiveness is for me, and that his presence is here for me. We've heard Jesus take the time to teach us one more time about his way, and that humility and service and sacrifice is the way of Jesus. And all of those things, I think, show us that even with the cross so close and his task as God's great rescuer coming to a climax, that Jesus, even though he's got all that on his mind, is still thinking about us even before he's thinking about himself. And then there's this. Because here's what happened next in that upper room as Luke records it. I'm reading from verse 31 and 32. "Simon, Simon," Jesus said, "Satan has asked to sift all of you as wheat. But I've prayed for you, Simon, that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers." Again, there's a lot on Jesus' mind this night. He knows the cross is coming and that it's coming soon, less than 24 hours away. And Jesus knows every bit of what's coming and how much that is going to hurt and cost him. And still here he takes the time. He takes the time to pray for Peter and for the rest of the disciples, because Jesus knows what's coming for them as well. And he knows that they're going to need his help to make it through. And so Jesus prays for all of them. And then even more specifically for Peter. Because Jesus knows that when he's arrested, all his disciples are going to run away. And then on top of that Peter, when he comes back, is going to end up denying him not just once, but 3 times. And so while guilt and shame and regret is going to run through all of them, Jesus also knows it's going to run especially deep in Peter. That guilt and shame and regret, it could break him. It's a powerful thing. Guilt can lead us to despair and cause us to give up on God. And Jesus doesn't want that to happen for Peter, for any of the disciples, for us. And so Jesus prays for our failures, which he knows are coming, and he prays that those failures won't be final and that they won't be fatal. "I have prayed for you," he says here. And I believe the words are saying there, and I'm continuing to pray for you because I know what's coming and because I know you need it. And that doesn't just apply to Peter. If you want a little homework this week, go back into that book of John and turn to chapter 17, and you can read a whole chapter there how Jesus is praying for the church and for you. Isn't that comforting? To know that Jesus prays for you and that he's praying for you, and to know that even as he has the cross staring him in the face, still he's thinking about you before he's thinking about himself. That's a real comfort to me, especially in stressful times. That Jesus not only knows what I'm going through, and he does, but Jesus is actually praying for me as I'm going through it. And he wants to help me through it, and then to help others as they go through similar things. Now, if you've read the story before, you know that Peter did give into temptation. He had the chance to stand up, and instead he denied ever knowing Jesus. But even though Peter stumbled, well, Peter got back up, and he found forgiveness, and he learned a little more humility, And he used that whole experience to end up encouraging and strengthening the other disciples who'd also turned their backs on Jesus. Did you think that Jesus' prayer here had anything to do with that? With Peter's returning to faith? I do. And I think, based on what I know about Jesus, that as I lean into Jesus and his grace and his mercy, that he's doing the same thing for me. That Jesus keeps on praying for me. So that when I make the wrong choice, as I often do, that I turn back to him again. And when I do, I find that Jesus is right there ready to wrap his loving arms around me and pick me up and hold me close and get me back on the right road again. A road where maybe I can use what I've learned from my mistakes to help point other people to the loving embrace of Jesus too. I think it was Rick Warren who said once that God never wastes a hurt. And I think it's true. God doesn't send the hurt, but God can use it. And I think that's what he's doing with Peter here, praying for Peter, not only that his wrong decision doesn't destroy him, but praying also that using that pain and the recovery from it in the loving embrace of Jesus, that Peter will use that to help strengthen other disciples and bring them back toward greater faith, which is what Jesus also might be doing for you. Praying for you in your hurt and your praying. Praying that your hurt and your pain doesn't destroy you. Praying that you see that Jesus is willing and wanting and waiting to take you back with open arms. And praying that you might be able to, as you return, to share your story with someone else who's going through something similar and help them find their way through their own guilt and pain and regret and find their faith again and find their way back to Jesus. Jesus always thinks about us before thinking about himself. Isn't that comforting?